Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, this is a very important episode. Wars are usually remembered by their battles, the armies crossing borders, cities burning, civilians fleeing, soldiers dying. But by the time the shooting starts, the process that produced the war may have been underway for months, years, sometimes even decades. If we look across roughly 3,000 years of recorded history, from the empires of the ancient Near East through Greece and Rome, the religious and dynastic wars of Europe, the world wars, the conflicts of our own time, certain patterns appear again and again. Not every war follows the same formula, and not every conflict has one obvious aggressor. But when a government actually intends to expand its territory, destroy a rival, or impose its will by force, its behavior is remarkably familiar.
And that is important, ladies and gentlemen, because history rarely gives us a trumpet blast announcing, "Attention, world, a major war begins next Tuesday." Instead, there are signals, military preparations, territorial demands, violations of agreements, propaganda of all kinds, threats, smaller acts of aggression, manufactured grievances, and repeated assurances that nobody wants war. Sometimes these assurances are sincere, but sometimes they are not. What is disturbing, my friends, is how often the warning signs were visible and how often other governments convinced themselves that the aggressor would stop after just one more concession.
So today, we're not asking simply why wars happen. We're asking something more uncomfortable than that. We're asking what do countries actually do before they start them? And when other countries recognize the danger, why are they so often unable to stop it?
One of the oldest preparations for aggressive war is the construction of agreements. The ruler rarely says, "I want somebody else's land." The public is told something quite different. "We have been cheated. We've been humiliated. Territory was stolen from us. Our people across the border are being mistreated. Our enemies are surrounding us. We are merely correcting an injustice." Ancient kings did it. Medieval rulers did it. Imperial governments of all kinds did it. Modern dictators do it. The grievance may contain some truth. That's what makes it believable and powerful. Germany really was angry over the Versailles Treaty and the provisions imposed after World War I. Austria Hungary really had suffered the assassination of its heir in 1914. Japan really did have economic and strategic interests in Manchuria. Great powers really do have legitimate security concerns, but a legitimate grievance and a legitimate right to invade another country are not the same thing.
That distinction gets blurred deliberately. The aggressor tries to turn a political dispute into a moral emergency. The message becomes, oh, we aren't choosing war. War has been forced upon us. Bullshit. That is one of history's oldest tricks because people who might hesitate to conquer someone else's country may enthusiastically defend their own. So the language changes before the armies move. Expansion becomes self defense, conquest becomes liberation, taking another nation's territory becomes recovering what was always legitimately ours.
And there's another step here that may be even more dangerous. The target is gradually stripped of legitimacy. Its government is described as criminal. Its population is portrayed as threatening, inferior, treacherous, barbaric, or somehow artificial. And sometimes the aggressor argues that the neighboring nation is not even a real nation. And once that idea takes hold, compromise becomes harder because you aren't negotiating with another legitimate society anymore. You're supposedly confronting an enemy that has no rightful claim to what it possesses.
And we can trace that behavior extraordinarily far back. Ancient empires used descriptions of rebellious people as wicked or treacherous to justify punitive campaigns. Religious wars could portray opponents not merely as political rivals, but as enemies of God. Nationalist wars introduce arguments based on race, blood, ethnicity, language, and supposedly historic borders. By the 20th century, propaganda machinery could do this on an industrial scale. Nazi Germany claimed that ethnic Germans outside Germany were victims who needed protection. It portrayed neighboring states as obstacles to Germany's rightful Aryan destiny. Japan portrayed its expansion in Asia as a supposedly stabilizing or liberating mission, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, even while establishing military domination. The psychological purpose is simple: make your aggression feel defensive.
Yeah, now we get to one of the most dangerous stages, the test. Major aggressors frequently do not begin with the largest possible invasion. They start with something smaller. They violate a treaty, occupy disputed territory, move troops into a supposedly protected zone, seize a small neighbor, sponsor armed groups, demand a concession. Then they watch. Who protests? Who mobilizes? Who imposes meaningful costs? And who merely issues a statement?
Hitler's Germany provides one of the clearest examples. Germany openly rearmed in violation of the post World War I settlement. In 1936, German troops entered the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Then came the Sudetenland crisis involving German speakers in Czechoslovakia. Each success changed Hitler's calculation. Austria disappeared without a European war. Britain and France then accept the German acquisition of the Sudetenland at Munich in September 1938 in return for Hitler's assurance that he had no further territorial ambitions against Czechoslovakia. 6 months later, German forces occupied the Czech lands anyway. By then, the lesson Hitler had learned was not that Europe loved peace, it was that Europe had repeatedly allowed him to change borders without being stopped.
And that's where avoiding war becomes horribly complicated. The governments making concessions generally aren't just cowards sitting around doing nothing. Britain and France remember the slaughter of World War One. Their populations remembered it. Their militaries had weaknesses, and their economies had endured the Depression. Their desire to avoid another catastrophic European war was rational. And the mistake was assuming that Hitler wanted essentially the same thing that they wanted, a negotiated settlement. But he did not.
Another recurring warning sign is obvious in retrospect, but surprisingly easy to rationalize at the time: military preparation that exceeds any reasonable defensive requirement. Armies gather near the borders, reservists are called up, rail lines and roads become military arteries, ammunition, fuel, field hospitals, aircrafts, ships, and logistics of all kinds move into position. The explanation is often reassuring: exercises, defensive precautions, armed readiness, routine maneuvers. Sometimes that is exactly what they are, but armies cannot conduct major invasions simply because a ruler becomes angry on a Thursday afternoon. Large wars require substantial preparation.
And that's why military behavior often tells us more than diplomatic language. Before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, more than 100,000 Russian troops had been positioned around Ukraine, while Russian officials continued to deny that an invasion was planned. Diplomatic negotiations continued. Then Russia recognized the separatist-controlled Donetsk and Luhansk entities, moved forces into Ukraine, and on February 24th, launched a much larger attack. The United Nations General Assembly subsequently condemned Russia's action as aggression and demanded withdrawal. The point here isn't to claim every troop concentration leads to war. Most do not. It is that large military preparations combined with escalating territorial demands and denial of another country's sovereignty are considerably more ominous than any one of those things by itself.
Now, there's another historical pattern here. The demand that looks diplomatic but may actually be designed to fail. An ultimatum can be a genuine last attempt at settlement, but it can also be a political weapon. Set conditions the other side cannot realistically accept, give them very little time, and announce that their refusal proves that they wanted the conflict.
The July crisis of 1914 is almost a textbook case. After Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary decided to confront Serbia. Germany gave Vienna extremely strong backing. Austria-Hungary then delivered an ultimatum containing extraordinarily severe demands and allowed Serbia only 48 hours to reply. Serbia accepted much of it, but resisted provisions that infringed upon its sovereignty. So Austria-Hungary declared war anyway. And here's what makes 1914 especially chilling. We know from the internal discussions that some Austrian officials were not simply trying to obtain Serbian compliance. They believed the military reckoning with Serbia was necessary. That means diplomacy was taking place after important leaders had already decided that diplomatic success might actually be undesirable.
Yeah, think about that. Negotiators in other capitals were trying to find terms that would prevent war. But if one participant has already concluded that war itself is the solution, better wording on the peace proposal does not solve the problem. You cannot successfully negotiate over the size of the concession when the real objective is the destruction or subordination of the other side.
This problem is ancient. Thucydides wrote about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta more than 24 centuries ago. Check out our Sparta podcast. There were immediate disputes involving places such as Corcyra and Potidae, but beneath them was a larger strategic problem. Athenian power had grown enormously, and Sparta increasingly feared what that meant. That is one of the reoccurring conditions behind war: a rising power and a frightened established power. Then, smaller allies become tripwires. One minor dispute suddenly involves two alliances. Each government fears that backing down will damage its political credibility, and every move becomes evidence of hostile intent.
And that sounds a lot like 1914, Dr. Dineen. Austria-Hungary versus Serbia could have remained a Balkan war. But Russia saw itself as Serbia's protector. Germany backed Austria-Hungary, and France was allied with Russia. Germany's military strategy involved striking France, and the German invasion of neutral Belgium helped bring Britain into the war. Within days, political leaders lost control of a chain reaction they had helped create.
Which points to an uncomfortable truth about alliances. Alliances can prevent war by warning an aggressor that attacking one country means fighting several. But they can also expand a war after deterrence fails. The alliance isn't necessarily the cause of the fire, but once the fire starts, it can carry flames from one building to the next. Another recurring warning sign deserves special attention: the pretext. Governments planning aggression frequently want the other side to appear responsible for starting the conflict. Sometimes there really is a border incident. Sometimes a real incident is exaggerated. Sometimes a circumstance can be manipulated. And sometimes an outright fabrication is used to give a planned operation the appearance of self-defense.
Japan's move into Manchuria in 1931 is a classic example. An explosion damaged a section of the Japanese controlled South Manchuria Railway near Mukden. Japanese forces blamed Chinese actors and used the incident as justification for military action. The response rapidly exceeded anything resembling the local protection of a railway. Japanese forces occupied Manchuria and eventually established the puppet state of Manchu Kuo, ruled by the last Chinese emperor. The League of Nations investigated. It objected. The United States refused to recognize territorial changes achieved by force. But nobody was willing to use sufficient force or economic pressure to reverse what Japan had done. Japan kept Manchuria.
And every aggressor watching that learned something. International agreements apparently said one thing, and military reality said another. Now, we should be really careful with the word appeasement because today it's almost automatically an insult. A compromise isn't always appeasement, and negotiation isn't weakness. Giving up something relatively minor to settle a legitimate dispute can prevent unnecessary wars. So, when does concession become dangerous, Dr. Dineen?
Chandler, that happens when the other side's demands aren't finite. If somebody says, give me this disputed province and the dispute is over, there may be something to negotiate. But if you give them the province and 6 months later they demand the neighboring country, you have discovered their first demand wasn't the real objective, it was a stage. The Munich Agreement is remembered so harshly because Hitler promised that acquiring the Sudetenland would settle his territorial claims against Czechoslovakia. Then he destroyed what remained of Czechoslovakia. That demonstrated that his previous assurances were unreliable.
So the lesson isn't never compromise. The lesson is find out whether the opponent is seeking a settlement or exploiting the settlement process. That's a much harder question because an aggressor has every reason to pretend that today's concession will be the last one.
Another theme, Dr. Weaver, that keeps appearing from ancient leagues to modern international institutions: agreements are only as strong as the willingness to enforce them. The League of Nations condemned Italian and Japanese aggression in the 1930s, but possessed no independent army capable of reversing Japanese conquest of Manchuria. Japan eventually left the League. Then Mussolini's Italy attacked Ethiopia. Hitler repeatedly violated the European settlement. The rules had not disappeared, but because the League didn't have peacekeeping forces the way the United Nations does, what had disappeared was confidence that violations would produce intolerable consequences.
So paper barriers are strongest when everyone already intends to obey them. They're weakest against the government they're most needed to restrain.
Exactly. A treaty does not physically stop a tank. What gives a treaty power is the belief that violating it will bring consequences: military, economic, political, or all three. When those consequences are uncertain delayed, or divided among dozens of governments, the aggressor may gamble that nobody will act, and sometimes that gamble succeeds.
That's right, Dr. Weaver. Now, and there's one more recurring ingredient here: optimism. Almost nobody starts a major war expecting decades of misery, economic destruction, hundreds and thousands of deaths, revolution, occupation, or a national ruin. They expect success.
That may be, Chandler, one of the most consistent mistakes in military history. Leaders convince themselves the enemy is weak, divided, decadent, badly led, or simply unwilling to fight. They expect allies to remain neutral. They expect the population being invaded to accept the new reality. They expect the campaign to end before economic sanctions matter. They expect one spectacular military blow to force negotiations. They expect to be greeted as liberators by the population. And sometimes it works, which is precisely why the temptation survives. But when it doesn't work, the aggressor has already committed enormous political prestige, military resources, and thousands of human lives. At that point, backing down can become harder than continuing.
And so, a war that was supposed to solve a problem becomes a machine that manufactures new problems. Looking over these cases, peace efforts commonly fail for several different reasons. First, outsiders misread the aggressor's objective. They assume the demand is limited when it is not. Second, threats aren't credible. Leaders warn of consequences that everyone suspects they aren't willing to impose. Third, governments wait for certainty, but absolute certainty that an invasion is coming usually arrives when the invasion begins. Fourth, allies disagree over how dangerous the aggressor really is. One wants sanctions, another negotiation, another neutrality, another, just some more time. And fifth, everyone is terrified of becoming the person blamed for starting the war.
That final reason, Dr. Weaver, matters enormously. The aggressive state may understand that democracies and coalitions need political and public justification before acting, so it operates below the threshold that will trigger a decisive response. One violation, then another. Each individual move may appear too small to justify a war, but after 10 successful moves, the strategic landscape is completely changed.
Which creates the cruelest paradox of prevention. Stopping an aggressor early may require taking risks before the danger is obvious. Waiting until the danger is obvious may mean that the inexpensive opportunities to stop it are already gone. So, if we strip away the dates, the uniforms, flags, religions, and the political ideologies, what should people watch for? Not one signal, a cluster. A government insisting that historical humiliation must be corrected. Territorial claims against neighboring states. Claims that another country isn't really legitimate. Constant descriptions of neighboring populations as dangerous or inferior. Rapid military expansion. Troops positions for offensive operations. Treaties discarded. Smaller violations used to test the reactions of other powers. Demands backed by military threats. Deadlines designed to eliminate meaningful negotiation. Incidents used as justification for actions prepared long beforehand. And repeated claims that every aggressive move is purely defensive.
Now, let's be clear, none of these actions alone proves that a war is coming. History does not operate like a checklist, friends, where 5 boxes mean an invasion on Monday. When several begin appearing together, the probability changes, especially when one government repeatedly gains territory or political control, and every supposed final territorial demand is just followed by another.
Perhaps the greatest mistake we make when studying war is starting the story on the day the armies attack. By then, we are often beginning at the end. The real story may have begun years earlier with resentment cultivated for political purposes, with historical claims transformed into territorial demands, with minorities turned into excuses for intervention, with treaties violated just a little bit at a time, and with military forces quietly moved into position.
Sadly, friends, 10,000 years of history doesn't give us a magic formula for preventing war. Sometimes deterrence works, sometimes compromise works, sometimes sanctions work, sometimes alliances work, and sometimes every peaceful option fails because a ruler has already decided long ago that the benefits of war outweigh the cost. That is the fact diplomats are most often reluctant to accept.
Because peace requires at least some willingness to compromise on both sides. If one side is asking, how do we avoid war? While the other side is asking, how much can we take before anyone stops us? Well, then they're not participating in the same negotiation.
And that may be the most important warning history gives us. The danger isn't simply angry speeches. It isn't simply armies. It isn't nationalism, alliances, sanctions, or territorial disputes. The danger comes when they converge. Grievance, dehumanization, military preparation, repeated boundary testing, manufactured justification, and a growing belief that opponents lack either the strength or the will to resist. Wars are remembered for the moment the shooting begins. History suggests we should pay much more attention to everything that happened before it.
Quite so. For Dr. Weaver, Chandler, and myself, we thank you for listening and look forward to your comments and subscriptions. Goodbye for now, friends.